Hello, I'm Jim McLean. I've been a reporter for newspapers and Kansas public radio stations for more than 40 years. But it's my work with the Kansas Oral History Project that brings me to Emporia and to this historic house, Red Rocks. It was once the home of William Allen White, the famous editor of the Emporia Gazette. Known as the Sage of Emporia, White's opinions on politics and other weighty matters, widely published in columns and essays, captured the attention of the entire nation. Given White's legacy, we thought his home, now a state historic site, was an appropriate place to interview some more recent Kansas journalists, reporters who spent their careers covering politics and the policy-making process. But we also saw it as an opportunity to revisit White's history, and it just so happens we have the perfect person to help us do that. Beverley Olson Buller is a former teacher and the author of 4 nonfiction books, including From Emporia, the story of William Allen White. And she's waiting for us just inside. Welcome, Beverley. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
All right. Before we get into our conversation, I have a little business to take care of, so just bear with me here. Today is October the 14th, 2025. We're at Red Rocks, of course, William Allen White's home in Emporia. This interview is part of the Kansas Oral History Project's series exploring contributions of reporters, editors, press secretaries, and others who spent their careers informing the public about state and local policy making. The Kansas Oral History Project is a nonprofit corporation that collects and preserves the oral histories of Kansans. The project is supported by donations from generous individuals and occasional grants. Our videographer is former Kansas State Representative David Heineman, and our producer, of course, is Susie Murphy. So now to our conversation.
Yes.
Again, thanks for being here. You are, I can just tell by our conversation prior to starting the interview, you are a true expert on William Allen White. And we're doing this series of interviews, many of them here at White's home, because we thought it was important. It set kind of the context for the journalism conversations that we want to have. So what I'm curious about, since you know so much about White, just kind of to start with, let's just backtrack a little bit. Give me a little bit more of your bio. I gave a little bit of an indication of who you were, but fill in the blanks for me, would you?
Well, I was born and raised in Kansas, and I was an Kansas educator for a total of 40 years. 34 at middle school and high school level, teaching English and social studies, and the final 6 years of the 40 was spent here in Emporia, although I taught adjunctly for Emporia State University's library school.
Okay.
And I was I mentioned English teacher, social studies teacher, and for 18 years in public schools, I was a school librarian. And it was while I was a school librarian that I decided that not every child could read a book this thick about William Allen White, and there was an interest in him. So I took it upon myself when I attended the grand opening of this home in 2005 to decide. I decided that day, and I talked to William Allen White's great-grandson, Chris Walker, and said, I'm going to write a book about William Allen White that middle school students can read and enjoy. And I did that. And one of my goals was to have some type of photo or graphic on every page. And I was able to accomplish that. So even a child who doesn't want to read the text will learn about Mr. White just by looking at all of the graphics.
And you're continuing your work, with the foundation and with his home and everything else. I mean, describe that. What are you up to?
I always joke that if William Allen White's involved, I'm probably in there somehow. I have been on the committee that selects the books for the Children's Book Award that is named after Mr. White for 25 years. I recently, as of 2 weeks ago, finished my time as chairman of that committee. I did that for 18 years. So I'm now chairman emeritus, so I will still remain involved. I will not read all the books every year. I read 122 children's books for our deliberations this year. The committee only has to read half, but as the person who will be directing the discussion, I read them all every year. So I do that. I am also on the William Allen White Community Partnership Board, which oversees the running of this state historic site in which we are sitting. We generally meet monthly, and we do fundraising. We plan events here at the site to get people to come in. One thing we'll talk about at our meeting today will be White Christmas, tongue-in-cheek, White Christmas is held at the home of William Allen White every December. And we have local music groups come in. A lot of times there'll be even elementary children, and they'll gather here and sing. If the weather's nice, they've gathered on the wonderful porch. And so that becomes we get donations, so that becomes kind of a fundraiser. We write grants sometimes as well and maintain the site. We mentioned earlier Kevin Wilmot. When White was having his anniversary of his 150th anniversary of his birth a few years ago, a group of us decided a film was needed. We worked with David Seaton, bless his heart.
David Seaton, the publisher of the Winfield career, and Kevin Wilmot, the well-known professor at KU and film producer,
filmmaker,
Oscar winner.
For his writing.
Right.
Yes, so we got Kevin to do a wonderful film, and he and some others wrote the script, and it was entitled What's the Matter with Kansas? And I was interviewed for that, but I was also on the small group that worked for fundraising and setting up. I wrote grants and that sort of thing to make that film happen, and it's available on the foundation website, also on YouTube.
Well, good. And I want to talk about What's the Matter with Kansas in just a minute, but I want to talk about this house briefly.
Yes.
Red Rocks.
Yes.
William Allen White bought the Emporia Gazette, 1895, and he bought it for $3,000, all borrowed money. And in those days, it was one of several papers here in Emporia. It wasn't even the only Republican paper here in Emporia, so he had his work cut out for him. So and they moved into this house. He and his wife Sally moved into this house in 1899. Did you say?
Years earlier than that, because they bought it in 1899.
Oh, but they rented it first.
Yeah, they rented it for a short time, and then were able to purchase it in 1899. And then their first child, William Lindsay, was born in 1900.
Okay.
And then Mary in 1904. And as he said in his autobiography, they lived happily ever after in this house. Yeah. And this is the house in which he died. Sally lived on in this house. He died in 44. She died in 1950, and she lived on in this house until her death in 1950. She died at a local hospital, but she was able to look out the window and see William Allen White Elementary School, named after her husband, being constructed. And I understand she took a tour in a wheelchair before she died. She died in December of 1950.
So Red Rocks, you say they rented it first, then purchased it, and a local attorney built this house, and it featured the red stone, the red rocks from Colorado even then, right?
Yes. The Whites had taken a honeymoon to the southwest and ended up in Estes Park.
Okay.
And they would have been around the Garden of the Gods area. So they were familiar with this red sandstone. And when they bought the house and when they first lived here, up until 1921, this was a Queen Anne Victorian. And it was redesigned by Frank Lloyd Wright, who was not someone that really enjoyed remodeling homes. But Mr. White talked him into it. I have wonderful letters between the two men. And Mr. Wright, this gets confusing.
Yes.
Mr. Wright,
Wright and White,
yes, had designed and built from, he did everything when he built a house for you. So even the furnishings and the dishes and what went on the walls, all the decor was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright for Henry Allen, who had been governor of Kansas. And he was a good friend of Mr. White. And that beautiful home is still in Wichita. It's a museum. But Mr. White had seen the work of Frank Lloyd Wright when he had visited his editor in Chicago. His name was Williams, many years earlier. And then, of course, everybody was interested in him. So he got Frank Lloyd Wright to begin work on remodeling, making this into a more modern 1920s style house, and yet maintaining a lot of its architectural integrity. Yeah. Wright drew the line when White said, no, I want to keep all of our antiques. This piece over here belonged to my mother. We already have dishes. We've traveled. We want to keep these things. So he set Mr. White up with a company, an architectural firm in Kansas City, and guess what their name was? White.
Oh, wow.
W-I-G-H-T. So we have Wright, White, and White. So White and White finished the design. They added dormer windows, they moved the front door. Mr. White wanted a large porch, that became kind of a room in the summer. There's a wonderful photo of him with his son, his grown son and wife sitting outside the window over here, and they have the phone coming through that window. And White's laying in the hammock, so that became another room. But for that remodel, they had to locate the red sandstone that this house...
To match what was originally on the house.
Yes, they wanted to totally match it. And Mr. White said that he sent little chips of this red sandstone to all of the Chamber of Commerce's that would have been on the Front Range of the Rockies, because he knew it came from that area. And he found the quarry, and it had been closed, but they opened it, and I believe Mr. White bought all of it, and it would have been brought by boxcar back then.
Boy, when you start digging into history, you can just keep going, can't you? I mean, in terms of just
one thing
the
leads to
minutiae,
another.
the details, it's fascinating.
Yes, it is. It is indeed.
I had no idea that he knew Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh my, the letters between the two, amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, and Mr. Wright was really a genius, which everyone knew, but you read these letters, he was so persuasive, and he told Mr. White, your home... No, he told him, your home could be an oasis in the architectural desert of Kansas, or something like that. I have the letter. And of course, Henry Allen's home was definitely that
Henry Allen,
oasis.
his name will come up later when we talk about the governor's race in 1924.
Yes.
So, okay, he bought the Emporia Gazette, and he had to prove to the Emporia community that one, he was going to be, a part of the community and a good business person and reliable, etc. And he was a lifelong Republican, a progressive, Republican at that. But he was, and in those days, towns the size of Emporia, had a Democratic newspaper, a Republican newspaper, typically more than one of each ilk. And so, he had his work cut out for him when he first got here. And it wasn't long after he bought the paper that he wrote that famous editorial, which was, I guess, never published in the paper, but still widely circulated around the country.
It was published in the paper.
Was it? Okay.
Oh, yes, in August of 1896. And it went from there, like all his stuff did.
Right, and other people politically who were opposed to the populist movement at the time adopted it and used it nationally.
Including McKinley, Mark Hanna for McKinley.
Called What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yes.
And it was a screed against essentially populism.
Yes.
And the hayseeds he thought were, running communities and running state government at the time. And he wrote it in a fit of anger because he just had a confrontation with some people on the streets of Emporia, right? I have the story correct there?
Yes, it was a hot August day, and he was anxious to get things squared away at the Gazette so he could travel out to Colorado and meet his wife. They were married, but they hadn't had their children yet, and they were renting a place in the Estes Park area. And so he was anxious to get out of town, and this small group, I don't know how small they were. In his autobiography, it sounds like it's practically a mob. And so they are assailing him, making fun of him. He claims one of them even got a stick and was poking at him. And he just was done with them. And so he needed to write an editorial. So he dashed this off, this What's the Matter with Kansas, written very tongue-in-cheek, that, they're running us into the ground. We're the laughing stock of the whole United States.
Other states are growing, but we're not, and they're the reason why.
Yes. And so he put it up to be composited, and his compositor told him later, Mr. White, you don't know how close I came to just putting that in the trash can.
Well, she was a populist. No, somebody who worked.
Yes, Laura French.
Right.
And yes, she was supportive of them, and also she knew he might have been committing political suicide.
Right.
She put that in the paper, but she did, and of course it was the whole other direction because it was immediately picked up and republished. Mark Hanna, who he had met before, and McKinley, who he had met, I believe he met him in like 1894. And they wanted to use it to help with McKinley's reelection. So he met McKinley for a second time.
And you're talking about the president.
The president, yes. And, but and Mr. White commented, I became famous overnight.
Yeah.
Because he really did. And if we could backtrack just a little bit, there's another very important editorial when we talk about his early days at the Gazette. The first editorial he wrote in June of 1895 was called Entirely Personal.
Right.
In which he introduced himself to the people of Emporia and shared a little bit of his vision for the paper. And he says in there that I hope to always sign my name from Emporia, whether home or abroad. He hadn't even been west of the Mississippi at this time, but he knew he was going places. And he also said something I really like. He said, I believed that local news, if honestly and energetically presented, would do more for subscriptions than its editorial page. And he did that. He focused on local news. He had a telegraph. He could pull stories and republish them, but he really focused on being on what we would say Main Street commercial here in Emporia and talking to people and finding out what was going on. And he specialized in obituaries. He would write lovely obituaries about people. Might have been a dog catcher, but he knew them and they had an interesting life, and he knew people would buy papers.
And so he made himself a really central figure in the community.
He did.
Right.
He truly did. And something else that is, he says, the new editor desires to make a clean, honest, local paper. If he could get an office, he wouldn't have it.
Yeah, that's right. He said right off
Yes.
the bat that he wasn't going to seek political office.
And he
right.
took it a step further. He told Mark Hanna, you may use What's the Matter with Kansas, but I want to meet with McKinley face to face, and I want to have him sign whatever was needed, saying that I don't want an office. Because, I mean, he could have been made Postmaster General or something. He didn't want any kind of office. And so there is a letter, it's probably still hanging on the wall of the Gazette from Mark Hanna that has that.
And who was Mark Hanna?
He was the manager of McKinley.
Okay.
He was his campaign manager and his person that he worked with.
He somewhat later came to regret that editorial. It did make him famous, but you know, he certainly evolved politically from the views expressed in that editorial.
Yes, don't we all? You know, we do. Yes, we change as we get older. And yes, he was going to seek no political office until it was almost an office he didn't seek. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about just his evolution, because it gets very interesting. He becomes an ardent progressive.
Yes.
It's not the same as populism, but progressive.
Yes.
And at that same time, Theodore Roosevelt was just coming to the fore politically in the late 19th century, early 20th century,
Yes.
obviously.
Yes.
And you know, he was the trust buster. You
Yes.
know, the Gilded Age had just finished, and Theodore Roosevelt, even though he was of that class, I mean, a very a rich person of the Roosevelts of New York, really decided it was time that the federal government needed to be empowered to start regulating some of these trusts, these big businesses and so forth.
Yes.
And White joined that cause. And just talk a little bit about his evolution and how important, what an important voice he had here from the Midwest, Sage of Emporia, in terms of kind of the everyman voice relative to that progressive movement.
Yes. And you know, speaking of Mr. White's political stances, it's probably important that we go all the way back to El Dorado, Kansas, where William Allen White's father was mayor. He was born in Emporia, but when he was about a year old, his father said, it's getting too crowded, we're going to move to the prairie, so they went to El Dorado.
And that was where his first journalistic experience was too, in El Dorado.
Exactly, yes, was in El Dorado and Emporia. But his father was a Democrat. And his father was very interested in politics. And he would take young Will up to the State House, and they were building the State House. He remembered seeing the foundation going up on the State House. And his dad was really interested in Democratic politics. And he was mayor of El Dorado. He died when Will was 14, and Will became the man of the house. His mother was a very independent woman. She was a Republican. And the two of them got along. They just never discussed politics particularly. But now it was Will and his mother. And he realized when he was going to college at KU that he thought, I have got to make a decision. Am I going to be a Democrat or am I going to be a Republican? And he talked to several of his professors at the University of Kansas. And they said, yeah, you do need to decide, and don't waste your time being an independent. You need to either be Democrat or Republican. Well, the Democrats, of course, later kind of absorbed the Populist Party.
Right, they did.
But he decided...
William Jennings Bryan became their nominee for president at one point, the Democratic, so yeah, they did.
Yes. And so, but he decided, and I don't think he was I know his mother did not even influence him, other than the fact that he had to live with her, but he decided he was better suited to the Republican Party. And I know that made his mother happy because his mother had gone to school at Knox College in Illinois, and she had been able to witness one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so that was one reason she was a Republican. She loved Abraham Lincoln. And so, yes, he became a Republican, and he made friends with a lot of Republicans in Emporia and around the state. Some of them were, I won't say shady, but they were deal makers, that type of thing. And he tried to always be in the middle as much as he could. And then once he met Teddy Roosevelt, he said, Teddy bit me and I went mad.
That's right, that was the quote.
Yes,
yeah.
and he did. And the two of them, I can only imagine the talk that they had in this house, in Teddy's house, in the White House, the talk they had about what our country could look like. And so he evolved. And Mr. White once wrote in an editorial that consistency is a paste jewel. In other words, it's worthless. And it's normal to say one thing when you're 20 and another thing when you're 40.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he did. He evolved. Yeah. And he had a wife whose father had been a Confederate officer, and yet both of them fought for civil rights. And his wife grew up in the South, but she was open-minded. And I know she talked to him a lot about, why can't women vote, Will? What are we going to do about this? And look how women are treated in hospitals. Can't we have maternity wards? That sort of thing. And that comes into his politics, too.
It's really interesting, too, because you mentioned the straight line back to Abraham Lincoln with his mom. The Republican Party in those days was known as the Party of Lincoln.
Yes.
You have to really separate these, the
and
vision
the
of what that party
nowadays
stood
is
for
totally different. Yeah.
then versus now.
Evolution.
Because Kansas, of course, was a Republican state, and generally speaking, I think you could characterize the governing philosophy of the Republicans in Kansas as somewhat socially progressive but fiscally conservative. I mean, that was just kind of the way the state was run for so many years, and certainly White fit into that. But you're right, when he and Teddy Roosevelt do you know how they met?
Yes, I can tell you how they met. They were introduced, I need to check a name here. I don't want to say something wrong.
No, I'm glad you brought these.
Oh, well, I have to have notes. Oh, yes, because I'd forgotten this. I spent quite a bit of time yesterday with his autobiography, which I have to do sometimes, and I like that I do it. Charles Curtis.
Oh.
Charles Curtis,
the
from
former,
Topeka,
the Kansan who was the vice president.
Eventually became vice president. He was a senator at the time.
Right.
He said, Will, there's someone that wants to meet you, and he's the Secretary of the Navy. His name's Theodore Roosevelt. He'd like to meet you. So Curtis set up their meeting. And Mr. White said, I've never met a man like him, and I know I never will again. I mean, they just hit it off.
A lot of people who met Teddy Roosevelt had the same.
I think he was just charismatic.
He was one of those people that when he walked into a room, he just sucked the air out of the room.
I think so. Yeah. Wouldn't it have been wonderful? Wouldn't you just like to have 5 minutes? I'd like to have 5 minutes in this house when the Whites lived here. But, you know, to have 5 minutes to actually, you can watch a speech of Teddy, and he was forceful, and you can see that. But I bet, yes, to actually get to meet him the way Mr. White did, you can see why he bit him and he went mad.
Well, he once gave a speech after an assassination attempt with a bullet.
Yes.
You know, he talked for more than an hour, then went to the hospital.
But he had a thick, his speech was folded up in his pocket.
And his speech typically was so thick because he talked,
Exactly. Right. And being a hunter, he knew that he probably had not been injured in, an artery or anything. So yes, he gave a speech while he was bleeding, and then he was very pale and he went to the hospital for a while.
So he had a friendship with Theodore, and Teddy Roosevelt actually was in this house.
Yes, he was.
Several times.
And you think about, and when I give tours of this house, especially with children, I'll say, Okay, so presidents visited this house, and when Teddy Roosevelt visited this house, it was the early 1900s. Where do you suppose they went to the bathroom? Well, they didn't know. So I can show them a picture. The outhouse is back here. So, but I said,
here?
even the president, no, it's long gone, but the picture is
Oh,
here.
picture.
Yeah, but I can show children the picture of where the outhouse, you go out the back door and it would have been out there. But I said, and the White House would have even had an outhouse in those days. That was the way things were. But when they bought this house, it had nothing in it. So they had to put in gas, they put in electricity, they put in the plumbing, running water, modernized it as they lived in it. But when Teddy visited, and the most important time he was here was probably in 1912, and that was
Right.
the bull moose thing. And Mr. White wrote an editorial thanking the people of Emporia for minding their own business, because Teddy was able to have a relaxing time. He sat on the porch. He played with William Allen White's son's dog, who was named Teddy, on the porch. There's a picture. Will took him to church on Sunday, and he was so proud that Teddy didn't even have to use a hymnal. He could sing every hymn. And then they came back here for lunch in the dining room. They had fried chicken. Teddy said it was the best meal he ever had. Then they went for a ride in the buggy, and old Tom, the horse, pulled them, and they went around town. And I'm sure they waved at people, and people went, "Oh my gosh, that's Teddy Roosevelt." But nobody accosted them. So that next week, Mr. White wrote an editorial and said, "Thank you for giving a tired man some rest."
Yeah, Roosevelt had been president.
Yes.
He was out of office, and he had kind of his heir, somebody
Yes.
who he had mentored, a great
Yes.
friend.
He chose
William
him.
Taft was the president, and Roosevelt was counting on him to continue his progressive policies. He became disappointed in that Taft wasn't being
Yes.
aggressive enough, and
Yes.
so he decided he was going to mount another campaign for the presidency. And that's when, under the banner of the Bull Moose Party, right?
Yes.
Yeah, he was
The progressive, the tickets to the convention, they call it the Progressive Convention. But it began to be called the Bull Moose Party when someone asked Teddy, "Well, how are you feeling?" "Well, I'm as fit as a bull moose."
Right.
And so they began to call it the Bull Moose Party. William Allen White said that was the biggest political adventure of his life. And he was just brokenhearted when Teddy refused to run again. You know, he lost the first time, and then he said, "No, I'm done." And of course, he died in 1919, so in some ways he was done.
Right. Now, White, though, how do you describe his national influence? How did he become such a national figure?
It is interesting. And a point I make in the first book about Mr. White that I wrote, he became world famous in a time where the only media was newspapers, the occasional radio. It wasn't like there was he's not a talking head on TV. He didn't have a Twitter account, and yet he was known around the world. And it started with What's the Matter with Kansas. But then I think people, well, he used to work for the Kansas City Star. There were no journalism schools when Mr. White bought the Gazette. But he got a really good education working for newspapers in Emporia, in Lawrence, in El Dorado. In fact, he dropped out of the University of Kansas after his final first semester. He didn't finish because he got the opportunity to run a newspaper that he had worked at previously in El Dorado. He did everything. You know, he worked as a reporter. He did advertising. He said, "I really didn't quite know how to run the presses, but I could if I had to." Now that changed once he bought the Gazette, because you can't you can't have your thumb in everything. But yes,
He was he was called the Sage of Emporia,
Yes.
but he did it was this voice, eloquent writing,
Yes.
passionate writing, coming from the Midwest.
Right.
In those days, you know, and he had if it happens anywhere, it happens in Kansas
Yes,
first, you know, and
he said
so
that. That's
and
true.
and in those days, Kansas had a very progressive reputation and was kind of a bellwether state,
yes,
right?
yes.
You think
You'd
that
want
helped?
to check in. I feel like editors in other states and even across the water would check in with Mr. White. What does White have to say? He became known as a voice of reason. He became known, and you know, he wasn't a trendsetter. And yet he wasn't a follower either. He was a booster. But I mean, you could always check with him. What does he have to say? What does he think about this?
And then a really famous chapter in his life, he was a crusader against the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
To the point where he actually ran, despite his pledge many, many years earlier that he was never going to seek office,
Yep.
he ran for governor in 1924.
Yes.
Because he was really worried. The Klan was in its ascendancy at the time across the country, but particularly, surprisingly, not just the South, but here in the Midwest, Indiana, Kansas.
Oh, Indiana was taken over.
Yeah, and Kansas, there were Klan marches up and down the streets of, Topeka and other communities
Yes.
in the state. And so talk a little bit about why he took that on to the
Yes.
point where he decided he was going to run for governor.
He tried very hard not to take it on. And there are letters between him and, say, Victor Murdoch from Wichita, another editor and newspaper owner, where he says, Henry Allen, the former governor. Now, Jonathan Davis was the incumbent. He was the Democrat incumbent that was running again. But Henry had been before him. And Henry was the one, I give him a lot of credit, he was the one that tried to run the Klan out of Kansas. He tried legally while he was governor to prevent them. And he did all kinds of interesting things, including saying masks could not be worn in public. And that way they were not allowed to parade in their masks. Well, they weren't going to parade barefaced. And this was in Ark City when he started all that. And they canceled their parade. So I give Henry Allen a lot of credit.
Because they wanted to be essentially incognito.
Absolutely. They're the invisible empire.
Right.
And I give Henry Allen a lot of credit. So when Mr. White, when 1924 rolled around, fall of 1924 rolled around, and we had a Democratic and a Republican gubernatorial candidate that both had ties to the Klan, not overtly.
Right.
If you would ask them, they'd say not at this time, or I guess Jonathan Davis, the incumbent, just wouldn't even talk about it. But there were plenty of and some newspaper articles would even say Ben Paulin, the Klan endorsee. So, but it was not done publicly, and yet it was in the papers.
Well, the book that I read suggested that Paulin won a tight primary mainly with Klan votes.
Yes, most likely.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, so people like Henry Allen were encouraging, and White was also trying to, who would do this? Who would run? You don't have to win, you just have to run. And so finally, in September of 1924, he literally threw his hat in the ring. There's a picture of him with his hat. He threw his hat in the ring, and he came out with a little flyer, they called them Dodgers back then, that White announces. And he announced he was running for governor. He waged a 6-week campaign.
More than 100 speeches across
yes,
the state.
and I used to know that number, and I used to know how many miles. 105, that's right, and it was over 2,000 miles. He did not drive, so his son, Bill, came home from Harvard and was one of his drivers, traveled around the state. He stayed in the homes of other newspapermen. Every week, he would take $25 out of the bank and probably had some left over, because they mainly paid for gas, because he would get fed and housed at the homes of newspapermen, and they were proud to host him. The newspapers were very supportive of what he was doing, and the world was watching him. They had reporters even coming from London to report on him. I think he was about 56 years old, which would have been considered quite old back then. And here he was, like you say, giving all these speeches. He would talk wherever anyone would have him, and up until about the week before the election, his whole platform was anti-Klan.
And then he broadened it a little bit.
And then he broadened it, and I brought my little copy. An ad appeared in many newspapers. This one was from Council Grove. White is right, help him fight. If White is elected, the Klan will be put out of business in this state, declares high-powered rag face of the Ku Klux Klan for Kansas. All of a sudden, he's got a platform. And it's some of the things that he and his wife had talked about, like maternity wards and things like that.
And banking reform.
And banking and railroad reforms. Yeah, all of a sudden he has that. And he used that fabulous cartoon that appeared in the New York World that Roland Kirby did of Mr. White holding a gun. He didn't own a gun, but running the Klan out of Kansas. And that is effectively. Now, two ways he did that, ran them out. He made sure that whenever he gave a speech, he pointed out the fact that there were other anti-Klan folks running. And one of them was an attorney general. who had years earlier started an ouster of the Klan. And another one seems like he was superintendent of education, and those people got elected. So that
Yeah, White didn't, but the Attorney General candidate
White came
did, and
in
he
third,
eventually...
but the people that he hoped would get reelected got reelected. And then the other thing that was so important, and I know being in the media, he knew this, by doing what he did, he shined a spotlight on Kansas. Because Indiana, there was no William Allen White in Indiana. And so they were just inundated, and it took forever for them to get out of it. All the crimes that happened, it was just awful. But we had William Allen White in Kansas, and it shined the spotlight on what was happening. And like I said, reporters came, and the one from London even followed him around. She said he was like a little Don Quixote.
I read some quotes from his speeches. He didn't pull his punches.
Oh,
the
no.
language. Do
No.
you have any of his quotes written down there?
You know, I probably do.
Because
I do when I talk about this.
I was struck by some of the quotes about how pointed he was in describing the Klan. He called them masked. I can't recall the language, but if you have any.
Yeah, I've got some. This is a letter that he wrote to Herbert Bayard Swope on the 17th of September, 1921. And this is when the Klan was first starting to come in. And I quote, "An organizer of the Ku Klux Klan was in Emporia the other day, and the men whom he invited to join his band at 10 per join turned him down. Under the leadership of Dr. J.B. Brickell," see, he always put names in there. They didn't want him hiding. "Under the leadership of Dr. J.B. Brickell and following their own judgment, the Emporians told him they had no time for him. The proposition seems to be anti-foreigners, anti-Catholic, anti-Negroes." And then he ends by saying, "It is to the everlasting credit of Emporia that the organization found no suckers with $10 each to squander here. Whatever Emporia may be otherwise, it believes in law and order and absolute freedom under the Constitution for every man, no matter what birth or creed or race, to speak and meet and talk and act as a free, law-abiding citizen. The picayunist cowardice of a man who would substitute Klan rule and mob law for what our American fathers have died to establish and maintain should prove what a cheap screw outfit the Klan is." He pulled no punches. Also, real quick, in his announcement, the flyer. Of course, he knew that flyer was, I traced it in newspapers across the United States. It was already hitting the East Coast the day he announced. So in other words, he sent out a press release early, which he should. But in that flyer, I love this. He says, "I want to be governor to free Kansas from the disgrace of the Klan. And I want to offer Kansans afraid of the Klan and ashamed of that disgrace a candidate who shares their fear and shame." And something he did that I found remarkable, and very much like Mr. White, he wanted to run as an independent. Every now and then I hear someone talking about this gubernatorial race, and they'll comment that he was a write-in. Well, they're confusing Dr. Brinkley. He was a write-in, and thank God, because that saved us from him. But you needed 2,500 signatures to get your name as an independent on the ballot. Mr. White did not have any of his organizers get signatures in Lyon County. He got 10,000 signatures in support of him being on the ballot as an independent, and they were all from outside of this county. So no one could say, "Oh, it's just your people." Well, Kansas was William Allen White's people. Obviously they didn't all vote for him,
But that was
he came in third.
a strategic decision on his part.
Oh yes, I thought that was I was very impressed when I read that he did that. So yeah, and you know, that was also a very big political adventure for him.
What was?
The running for governor.
Oh,
because he always
absolutely.
said, "I will take no political office." So first there was the Bull Moose adventure, and then there was the gubernatorial adventure. And as I say, when I talk about him running for governor, he was not even 60. He lived to about 73, if I remember right. He still had life left in him to serve his country.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Which we'll talk about.
It was interesting because just to put a cap on that, he didn't win that race. He
Came in third,
Yeah.
a close third to the second. But
He
he
did.
said, "I wished I would have come in second."
Yeah. So got lots of votes.
Yes.
And the Attorney General candidate who was supportive of the anti-Klan platform did win, and
Yes.
eventually the Supreme Court ruled, and the
Yes.
Klan was
They were
essentially
not granted
pushed
a
out of the
charter.
state. Right.
They also were said to not be a charitable organization because that was their
As
big
they
thing.
claimed, yes.
Yes, they would put they wanted to be in all the papers. Mr. White was fair to them. He would report things. They had a state conference here and he reported it. Published the name of everyone attending in the hotel register. He put that in the paper. And so much for secrecy, but they loved it if they could get in the paper that, you know, Sunday night the Ku Klux Klan of Emporia came down the aisle of the church and made and it would always name the substantial donation. And honestly, in the 1920s, it would be a substantial donation, and they wanted that in the paper.
Right.
When Wesley Hospital was being built in Wichita, they made a substantial donation. It was in all the papers. They wanted to be seen as benevolent.
Well, we can draw an analogy between organized crime. Some of the biggest crime bosses in the country had a benevolent side to them because it was, public relations.
It was good for business.
Yeah, public relations.
Yes. So I loved that not only did the state Supreme Court say no charter for you, you cannot charge $10 to have your hood and your uniform, but you are not benevolent. You're not going to be a tax-exempt organization or whatever the benefits were back then. I don't know. But they loved to say that they were charitable.
In the context of the interviews that we're doing with journalists for this series, we've talked a lot with former reporters about the power of local newspapers across the state in the day. The Harris News Group, Salina and Salina, Hutchinson, Ottawa, Garden City, various communities, very good, strong newspapers with strong editors, strong publishers, much like William Allen White. There's a long history of that in Kansas, and they did help shape the political environment. This is a very good case in point in that White he was a journalist to the core. As you pointed out, he did report, he was fair to the Klan in terms of he reported on them and didn't just editorialize about them. But it just shows you the power of the local press in the state at that time. Editors, when they wrote their editorials about who they were endorsing and the reasons for endorsing, that carried some weight in those days.
We have a photograph in the dining room here of a dinner that Mr. White held for newspaper editors when Hoover was running. And of course that got a lot of votes. And he invited all the newspaper editors to come. It's out here in the garden. It was held out here in the garden. And he did that sort of thing a lot because he knew he had influence. And in his autobiography, which is written tongue-in-cheek, he jokes that, if you were a newspaperman or if you were a newspaper editor, everyone respected you. And you got a pass. You could go wherever, because he traveled all over on the Santa Fe. Well, he had a pass. And he got a pass when he was just a young reporter, because that was the way it was back then.
But, so Kansas has a long history of really quality newspaper publishers and editors, and he's probably preeminent among them. But he wasn't the only one. We have a long history of that in this state. And his service, so he ran for governor in the 20s, but he died in 1944. But late in life, he was respected, and this is another indication of his evolution, right? He helped Alf Landon. He was a big supporter of Alf Landon when Alf Landon ran for president against Franklin Roosevelt.
And it was because he was a Republican.
That's right. But then on the heels of that, later on, in the early 40s, when the world was at war, and America was not in World War II at that time, and there were really an isolationist sentiment in this country, wanting to keep us out of European wars, at all costs, right? And White essentially favored neutrality as well. But he took on the task of helping Franklin Roosevelt convince the country that we needed to help the Allies in any way we could against, the Nazi Germany, essentially. So, talk a little bit about it. He headed a committee at Roosevelt's invitation, as I recall, that came to be known as the White Committee, even though that wasn't its formal name, right?
Well, and this all started in 1939. There was a committee, and Roosevelt, FDR, asked White to chair it, and it only had to meet for a matter of months, but they had to work with the neutrality laws because they were laying the groundwork to be able to aid the Allies.
Lend-Lease, of course.
And then yes, Lend-Lease. And then in 1940 came then it became called it was the Committee to Aid the Allies. It had a very long name,
Right.
but everyone called it the White Committee, even though Mr. White only served on it for 1 year. He laid the groundwork, and he got off of it. I have a quote here from him,
Okay.
Which I think is real interesting. But he was able to lay the groundwork. It began in 1940. There were 300 branches around the country. By November of 1940, and he announced that he was leaving the committee in December of 1940, effective January 41. They had 750 chapters, and the committee published a book for which he wrote the foreword. It's called Defense for America. I have a copy of it. And it basically was trying to make people realize, we fought the Great War, and that was the war to end all wars. And
World
nobody
War I,
wants,
right.
World War I, and nobody wants to be in this war. But there are people suffering, and we want to be their allies. Doesn't mean we have to send our boys over there. A quote by him, he says, "Take off political buttons and wear just one button, defend America by aiding the Allies." Well, he had gotten sick. His wife's health had never been good. And so in December of and I think there were some pressures within the committee that he didn't always agree with. And he was by no means pushed out. People were very happy, including FDR. They were happy with what he did for the committee. But his health was failing by 1940, almost 1941. And his wife really had health problems. So he published this statement: "The job was too big a one for me. And after all, I have my own life to live. And after all, I wanted to celebrate my 73rd birthday in peace and devote the year or 3 that may be left," he was right, "to me in writing some books." He had started writing his autobiography and helping with some other chores around the house here in Emporia and in Kansas. Then January 4 of 1941, which would have been that first week where there was a new chairman, the New York Times had an editorial that said, and I quote, "His name and personality made the White Committee a going concern in its first and difficult days." Like I said, he laid the groundwork. And he was 76 when he died, and I'm bad at math. He was 76 when he died.
Well, that's very important because
It is.
Roosevelt knew Britain was standing alone.
Yes.
Very early in the war.
Yes.
And Churchill wanted America in the war in the worst way.
Yes.
And he made it clear in his meetings with Franklin Roosevelt at the
Yes.
time. Roosevelt knew there wasn't political support for that. But he had this policy of Lend-Lease where we were
Yes.
going to, initially, we're going to give the British Navy a bunch of old American destroyers
Yes.
because the aid with the convoys and everything else. And there was a lot of political opposition to that, but then it became Lend-Lease. We were going
Yes.
to lease them to
Sure.
Great Britain. And the White Committee was instrumental in helping build
Yes.
essentially some sentiment for
Yes.
doing that.
And it was a groundswell. Mr. White knew this, being in the media. You can't just have FDR do one of his fireside chats and say, "Oh, by the way, we're going to do this." It spread across the United States. People loved Mr. White. It doesn't happen anymore, but I wrote that book about Mr. White about over 10 years ago. Every now and then I would run into someone who knew of the White Committee, and they were so complimentary of it.
Yeah.
And it's another interesting thing that you probably know. Somewhere in this room is a copy of a Life magazine that has, from 1940, that has an article written by William Lindsay White. While he was traveling to London, to England, on a destroyer, one of the destroyers that was being lent to them, and he covered the Blitz. He went out on the street. He would go out. He would hide when the bombs were coming. But the minute they ended, he would go out on the street and interview people for the North American Newspaper Alliance. So he had a different view than his father about the war. And he would telegraph, we look at these people.
Yeah.
They're being bombed every night, and they have such a stiff upper lip. Can't we do more for them? So, and then when he came back, he gave speeches. He also brought William Allen White, a grandchild. He and his wife knew they could not have children. His wife worked for Life magazine, and they lived in New York, and so they adopted a war orphan. And she then ended up running the Gazette, and her son runs the Gazette now.
Yeah, that's a great history.
Yeah, the great history going back. But I found it real interesting that Mr. White, and I don't really see that he was particularly an isolationist.
No, I wouldn't put that.
Yeah, he was just very reluctant to commit. He understood why people would not want to, and then Pearl Harbor solved all that.
Right.
And he died in '44, so he was able to, and he said, we're going to win the war when he died.
I want to put a capstone on our earlier conversation about his evolution politically.
Yes.
Because he's a very big supporter of Al Landon, of course, who only won 2 states. Franklin Roosevelt clobbered him at the polls.
Yeah.
And nevertheless, White was, very supportive of some of Roosevelt's New Deal policies.
He was. He liked the New Deal.
He did, parts of it.
I mean, publicly liked it.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, I think that's an indicator of what kind of person he was in terms of, based on certain information and certain circumstances and the times and everything else, he wasn't just hard and fast,
No. He was open-minded, and I think that's one of the reasons that he was chosen to be on the first jury for Book of the Month Club. So he was with all these intellectual people choosing books that would go into subscribers' homes. And I think it's because they knew that he was open-minded. They read books like Grapes of Wrath. And, well, they just weren't sure about that. Boy, he was. We need that book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think he was a very open-minded, friendly, fair-minded person, willing to at least hear both sides.
And so we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about you think that we need to talk about?
Well, I could go down quite a rabbit hole with many stories.
This history
well,
in
and one
depth
thing,
and
one thing
detail.
that's kind of funny about FDR, because Teddy Roosevelt was his best friend, and FDR,
White's best friend, right?
Yes, but FDR, being a Democrat, had to be a little bit more careful about that friendship. And there is an autographed picture. It used to be at the Gazette, and it's of FDR giving a speech, and it says, "For my friend William Allen White, all 48 months of the year," or something. Because Mr. White made a joke that FDR is my friend 3 years out of 4, because he had to support the Republicans during election years. But if FDR was going to run, then no, he couldn't support him, at least not publicly. But he did support, like you said, the New Deal and what he was trying to do.
I love some of the correspondence between William Allen White and Teddy Roosevelt, because when Teddy Roosevelt would write him, it would just be White.
Yes.
That's the way he would address it.
And White called him the Colonel.
The Colonel.
A lot of times. Yes.
Well, a fascinating life.
Yes.
And I really, really appreciate this discussion because it does create a context for what we're trying to do here, to celebrate this man who was perhaps, the preeminent editor in Kansas history, and the characteristics that made him such a great journalist and such a great public figure, both.
And I so appreciate you realizing that including White in these interviews is important, because he inspired so many people. His name is not one that is known, and being so involved with the Book Award, I think I can say that if it wasn't for the Book Award, his name would not be nearly as well known.
We just can't
because children learn about him, and we do teach about him. I know my book is used a lot to help teach about William Allen White, because children can begin voting for those books in 3rd grade. So the name William Allen White, they've heard of it at least. And of course we hope they'll come to this beautiful home, which is a state historic site someday, and get to see how the Whites lived.
Well, we just can't lose touch with that history.
I agree.
Thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed this very much.